Night falls on an island in the Pacific Ocean. On one side, over 2,000 fierce soldiers from the Empire of Japan are given the order to capture Point Lunga and the Guadalcanal airfield. On the other side, 840 American soldiers are determined not to retreat even a single step, even if it means paying with their own lives. This was the starting point of the Battle of Edson Ridge, one of the most brutal stories of the Allied campaign in the Pacific. But how was it possible for a small battalion to annihilate thousands of well-trained and determined Japanese troops? In this new installment, we will find out by stepping into the boots of the soldiers who fought in Guadalcanal. During World War II, the Pacific Front was one of the main theaters of action for the U.S. forces. Many of their military operations were concentrated there, and one of the most impressive began in August 1942 with the Guadalcanal Campaign, also known to the Allies as Operation Watchtower. It lasted until February 9, 1943, marking the first major offensive launched by the Allies against the forces of the Empire of Japan, the Asian ally of the Third Reich. On August 7th, thousands of troops launched a massive landing in a series of territories south of the Solomon Islands, with the aim of preventing them from being used as Japanese bases. From there, the Empire could attack the supply routes between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand, cutting off any attempt at a powerful coalition. The Allies also sought to use Guadalcanal and Tulagi as a starting point from which they could support a campaign to capture or neutralize the main Japanese bases in Rabaul, New Britain. Being an ocean dotted with tiny territories, the Pacific presented great strategic complexities. Any conquered portion could mean military superiority.
After establishing an initial foothold within marine landings, the United States quickly found itself on the defensive. It would be the first time they faced off against a major Japanese army unit.
Initially, the Allied forces overwhelmed the Japanese troops, achieving a swift victory that allowed them to plant their flag in a region of great importance. To give you an idea of the significance of Guadalcanal, this small island even had an airfield under construction, which would allow for constant takeoffs near the Allies' supply route. This is why the Japanese were unwilling to relinquish the enclave. Since August 1942, they made several attempts to reclaim what was lost, resulting in a total of 3 land battles, 5 naval engagements, and daily aerial combat. Among the land battles, one was particularly marked by its violence and epic nature. The Battle of Edson Ridge, a fierce struggle for control of the Guadalcanal airfield. In response to the Allied landings, the Imperial General Headquarters of Japan assigned the 17th Army, a corps based on the island of Rabaul and commanded by Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake. Their task was to retake Guadalcanal from the Allied invaders. The problem was that Tokyo underestimated the situation, as they lacked accurate information about the actual number of Allied troops in the area, a grave error that worsened over the weeks. The 17th Army was heavily involved in the Japanese campaign in New Guinea, leaving few units available to send south to the Solomon Islands. Among the trained combat personnel were the 35th Infantry Brigade, under the command of Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, stationed in Palau, the 4th Infantry Regiment, based in the Philippines, and the 28th Infantry Regiment, commanded by Colonel Kiyonao Ichiki, embarked on transport ships near Guam. The different units began to move towards Guadalcanal immediately to concentrate all efforts into a single, powerful offensive. On September 7, 1942, Major General Kawaguchi decided it was time to, in his own words, lead and annihilate the enemy in the vicinity of the Guadalcanal airfield. His plan was to organize his troops into 3 divisions to approach the perimeter of Point Lunga, a coastal section to the north of the island, culminating in a surprise night attack that would destroy the Allied presence. One portion of the forces would advance towards the perimeter from the west, while a second army, known as the Kuma Battalion, would do so from the east. The main assault would come from Kawaguchi's central force, which had 3,000 soldiers divided into 3 battalions. By September 7th, most of the Japanese personnel were marching towards the coastal line of Point Lunga, with around 250 soldiers remaining at the base to guard the brigade's supply depot. On the other side, the Allies were aware that the attack was imminent and prepared for it.
Between August 21st and September 3rd, General Alexander Archer Vandergrift had made intense efforts to improve the defensive capabilities of the Lunga perimeter. He had relocated 3 Marine battalions from Tulagu and Gavutu to Guadalcanal.
And native scouts under the direction of Martin Clemens, an officer of the British Solomon Islands Protectorate Defense Force, sent reports about the Japanese presence. This way, the U.S. Marines learned of the Japanese soldiers stationed at Taivu. On September 8, 1942, the distinguished Brigadier General of the Marine Corps, Merritt Austin Edson, was put in charge of the situation. He planned a powerful offensive against the Japanese landings, which would allow them to defend all of Guadalcanal, even against a numerous and well-armed enemy. Edson's men, after being transported by boats to near the Taivu base, occupied Tasimboko, causing the Japanese defenders to retreat into the jungle. Moreover, at that location, the American troops discovered Kawaguchi's main supply depot, which contained large quantities of food, ammunition, medical supplies, and a powerful shortwave radio. After destroying everything in sight, except for documents and equipment that they took with them, the Marines returned to their initial perimeter. This was a severe blow to the Japanese strategy. Kawaguchi's men suddenly found their supplies depleted. But the most important thing was what the Americans learned from the raid. The amount of supplies, along with the intelligence gathered from the captured documents, indicated that at least 2,000 Imperial soldiers were on the island preparing for an attack. Edson, along with Colonel and Operations Officer Gerald Thomas, was correct in believing that the Japanese attack would come from a narrow, grass-covered coral ridge located 910 meters away and parallel to a river that bordered just south of the Guadalcanal airfield. This area, known as Point Lunga, provided a natural route to approach the facilities and had almost no defenders at that moment. It was the weakest link in the entire chain. To withstand the imminent assault, on September 11th, 840 men from Edson's battalion positioned themselves around the ridge. They knew their mission was suicidal, as they had to defend the area against an enemy who nearly tripled their numbers.
At nightfall, under absolute darkness, they stood their ground against incessant waves of Japanese soldiers sent by General Kawaguchi. Against all odds, the American troops defending the ridge shifted the landscape of the entire war.
Before the day ended, the Japanese attacked Edson's 840 Marines, who had to fall back several hundred meters before the Japanese halted their night assault. It was a promising start for the Japanese, but it was only the first encounter in a battle that would stretch over several blood-soaked days. The following night, Kawaguchi and his more than 2,000 soldiers faced the entire Allied force in what became known as the Battle of Edson Ridge, named in honor of the leader who made the victory possible. In this second engagement, the American front had a small ace up its sleeve, a supply of light artillery, which provided excellent results in defending their position. Kawaguchi's 1st Battalion attacked the American right flank, but this time it was not as straightforward as in the initial combat. Although they managed to break through the Marine lines, the Japanese attack was halted by the units guarding the northern part of Point Lunga. Thus ended the first night of fighting.
In the evening on September 12th, as nightfall chased the American soldiers, Edson stepped atop a grenade box and addressed his troops, saying, quote, "You men have done a great job so far, but I have one more thing to ask of you. We have to hold out just one more night."
The next morning, September 13th, Edson ordered a counterattack. They did not manage to penetrate much territory, so the American troops fell back to regroup with the reserves and avoid diluting their capabilities. On the other hand, the Japanese made good use of the daylight hours to prepare for a second battle. This time, Kawaguchi would not separate his battalions or send soldiers through the jungle, which proved to be a subtle tactic. Instead, his men would advance directly towards the enemy, just as Edson had originally anticipated. The next attack began as soon as the sun went down. 2 companies from Kawaguchi's 2nd Battalion attacked from the south and pushed Edson's troops towards Hill 123 in the central part of the ridge. During the night, the Marines in this position, supported by artillery, withstood wave after wave of frontal assaults from the Japanese soldiers, many of which turned into hand-to-hand combat, reminiscent of the wildest scenes of World War I and its trenches. Japanese units that had infiltrated beyond the ridge and near the airfield were also repelled before they could seize control of important positions. Nevertheless, the situation was much more complex than during the initial attacks. Kawaguchi's troops seemed determined to annihilate the Americans.
The situation was increasingly showing in favor of Japan. The American soldiers were getting scared and falling back, till Edson came out of the command post with a couple of officers and strongly yelled at his soldiers to keep on fighting.
Brutal attacks by support battalions known as Kuma and Oka, positioned at other locations along the Lunga perimeter, were repelled by Edson's 840 soldiers. Gradually, a legend was beginning to form in the Pacific, a nearly Spartan tale in which a small force managed to defeat a powerful army, inflicting painful and unexpected casualties. September 13th would forever remain among the bloodiest pages of the Japanese army. Their performance was disastrous. Almost half of Kawaguchi's forces were annihilated by Edson's men, who took advantage of the terrain, their weaponry, and a series of ambushes to overcome the attackers. On that night, the Americans suffered only 60 casualties, which was minimal in proportion. However, the victory was not absolute and could have easily turned into a defeat due to an incredible error. Due to technical and human communication problems, some of Edson's soldiers thought they were retreating towards the north, heading for Henderson Field. This created an organizational crisis that had to be resolved by Major Kenneth Bailey. The man, who had suffered a severe head injury, took charge of regrouping the soldiers and updating the strategy initially devised by Edson. In this way, a second defensive wave was established, allowing the battle to continue for more than 10 hours into the morning of September 14th.
The tide began turning as heavy artillery fire was used by the Marines against their enemy. The Japanese who made it past these defenses were met by armed soldiers. If some brave or talented soldier managed to avoid the guns, they would be met by American fists. Several hand-to-hand battles were fought in the darkness. Each wave of Japanese soldiers was taken down.
Without Kenneth Bailey's incredible actions, the Japanese could have captured Point Lunga and also Henderson Field, which would have been a severe blow to the American presence in the Pacific. One can only imagine how this would have affected the campaign against the Axis in Asia. As we've mentioned, these victories in small territories proved crucial for the final outcome of the conflict, as they allowed the Allies to maintain a constant flow of resources to strangle the Japanese Empire. On September 14th, Kawaguchi led the survivors of his brigade on a 5-day march to the Matanikau Valley, where they joined Oka's unit. In total, Kawaguchi's forces lost 805 soldiers, while the Marines suffered 104 casualties. The difference was staggering and humiliating for the Imperial Island. On September 15th, General Harukichi Hyakutake learned of the defeat and sent the news to the Imperial General Headquarters in Japan. In an emergency session, high-ranking officials from the Navy and the Imperial Army came to a late but fundamental conclusion. Guadalcanal could lead to a decisive battle in the war. The results of the clash began to impact Japanese operations in other areas of the Pacific, as it became necessary to redirect supplies, personnel, and weaponry to sustain Japanese presence south of the Solomon Islands.
The Battle of Bloody Ridge marked a great victory for the Marines, who called the conflict the Battle of Edson's Ridge.
General Harukichi Hyakutake realized that he could not send enough troops and supplies to defeat the Allied forces stationed on Guadalcanal without pulling support from other fronts in Oceania. Therefore, with the approval of headquarters, he ordered the withdrawal of troops from New Guinea until the Guadalcanal situation was resolved. Additionally, he prepared to send more troops to the area defended by Edson's men in an attempt to retake the airfield. As the Japanese regrouped to the west, U.S. forces focused on bolstering and strengthening the Lunga defenses. On September 18th, an Allied naval convoy landed 4,157 soldiers of the 3rd Provisional Brigade and a battalion from the 11th Marine Regiment, along with 137 vehicles, tents, aircraft fuel, ammunition, food rations, and engineering equipment on Guadalcanal. The cavalry had arrived, and now the Japanese faced a much more formidable enemy. This would not have been possible without the initial resistance of the 840 soldiers led by Merritt Edson, which had severely diminished the enemy's presence in the area.
General Kawaguchi had lost 830 men during the battle. A still unclear number of wounded soldiers were also lost during the trip to Martinicao. The Marines calculated taking out around 500 Japanese soldiers, while losing 80 comrades between the 12th and 14th of September.
The Allied reinforcements allowed for a continuous defensive line to be established around the perimeter of Point Lunga by September 19th. However, Japan also had its small victories amidst the conflict. The American aircraft carrier USS Wasp was sunk by the submarine in 19 southeast of Guadalcanal while attempting to protect the convoy with reinforcements, temporarily leaving the USS Hornet as the only operational carrier in the South Pacific area. Washington also made some changes in the command of its units, transferring several underperforming officers off the island and promoting others to fill their positions. As weeks went by, Guadalcanal became an increasingly solid stronghold for the Americans. Japan redirected much of its effort to fighting in the region, but was unable to counter the arrival of new troops, weapons, and supplies. Gradually, the fall of the Axis seemed inevitable. After the campaign, General Edson became the Chief of Staff of the Fleet Marine Force in October 1944, with his work recognized by a Gold Star on his Legion of Merit. His various duties, whether in combat or rear echelon service, resulted in a continuous 44-month deployment in the war zone. When a young officer asked him when he expected to be rotated back to the United States, General Edson responded, "When the war is over and the work is done." For his extraordinary tactical ability and heroic actions far beyond the call of duty, Major General Merritt Austin Edson received a Medal of Honor citation, the highest decoration within U.S. service. To this day, his strategies are studied to understand how to overcome a numerically superior enemy by leveraging the terrain, weaponry, and the context of a conflict. And so, we reach the end of this epic video, where we analyzed one of the most remembered actions of the Marines in the Pacific. If you enjoy this type of content and want to learn about equally important events, we invite you to subscribe and activate notifications for our channel. Without further ado, we bid you farewell until the next installment of Military History. Thank you for joining us.